Okay, so for today we're going to have a discussions about PHP and MySQL. So we're going to start a demonstration on how you'll be able to create a PHP program with MySQL and MySQL at the same time.
To databases, which means we're going to talk about what exactly a database is, and we're going to talk about which tool we're going to use to actually create a database. Now, I know some of you new people who's never done databases before. Databases might seem a little bit scary in the beginning, but I want you guys to realize we're not going to do anything really complicated with databases. We're just going to learn the basics for you guys to actually create a database and use it inside a website. So having said that, let's actually talk about what exactly a database is. Now, let's say we have a website, and inside this website, we need to save information, meaning that we might have a sign-up system where people can go and create a user account. Now, in order to create a user account, they need to go in and type in their first name, last name, username, password, that sort of thing. And after they've done that and they hit sign up, we need to save the information of that person who just signed up. Now, in order to do that, we need to have a database, because inside a database, we save all the information regarding what the user just did. So when they do actually log in, we can go into the database, fetch the information, and use it inside our website to actually, check if the login has actually been correct. Now, the way we're going to create a database is through something called PHP And if you guys do actually have XAMPP installed, which you guys should actually have because we've been using it for the past many episodes, you will have PHP installed on your computer already. So with XAMPP actually running, the Apache MySQL servers, you're going to go into your browser, go to your URL and type localhost /PHP And then you're going to come into this website here. Now, this is where we create databases. And as you guys can see, I do actually have quite a few over here on the left side. Well, I don't have quite a few. I just have a couple more than you guys have. And we're going to talk about the panel here for this episode. And we're going to talk about how to actually create a database. So as you guys can see, we have a menu at the very top here that has a lot of buttons in it. The one we're interested in, at least in the beginning, are the one called databases and SQL. Now, we do also have an export and import over here, which will actually be relevant for later. But for now, let's just go ahead and stick with databases and SQL. Now, on the left side here, we have a list of all the databases you do already have created inside PHP Now, there will be some here as a default. Like I said, there's going to be a couple, but just go ahead and ignore those for now because you won't actually be using them. Now, to create a database, we need to go to our databases menu up here in the top. Once you're in here, we can actually go down where it says create database and type in a database name. Now, a tip for you guys, don't use big letters and don't use dashes. Go ahead and use small letters and underscores if you have to do something. So let's actually go ahead and create a database here. I'm going to call mine PHP lessons. Now, you guys can call whatever you want. You just need to realize that if you call it something different than what I do here, when I do actually want to refer to the database and I say, type in PHP lessons, you guys need to type in the name of your database instead. So after I did actually type this in, I'm going to click create. So once I click create, you can see no tables found in database, and then we can actually create a table down here. You'll also notice that our new database is actually added to our list on the left side here called PHP lessons. Now, this is the one we're inside right now. So as you guys can see, we have no tables. Now, the way databases work is that we need to create tables, and each table is going to store information regarding one certain thing. So we might have one table that stores information regarding, the user, first name, last name, username, password, email, that sort of thing. And we might also have a table that stores information regarding posts. Let's say we have a forum inside a website. Now, in order for the user to actually go into the forum and write a message, they might need to write in the subject of the message, and the actual message and the date the message was actually written and who wrote it. Now that sort of information we also need to save, and that typically goes into a table for itself called maybe forum post or something. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about how to actually create these tables. And once we have created the tables, we can actually start going into our coding again and try and go into our database and fetch the information from the database and learn how to actually insert data into the database. That's also important. But we're going to do that in the next couple of episodes. So for now, just go ahead and get a little bit familiar with PHPMyAdmin, which is the tool we're going to use to create databases. And I do want to mention that a lot of online hosting companies where you buy a domain name, they will actually be using PHPMyAdmin for a lot of their databases. So PHPMyAdmin is a really good tool to get familiar with. And it's, a lot of them are very similar, but PHPMyAdmin is the most used one. So get familiar with this one if you have to get familiar with one of them. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. In the next one, we're going to talk about how to actually create the tables. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time. In the last episode, we talked about how to create a database inside PHPMyAdmin, and in this episode, we're going to talk about how to create a table inside a database. Now, just to kind of remind you guys, one table stores one type of data inside a website, meaning that we might have one table that stores information regarding users, we might have another table that stores information regarding a post inside a forum, so we can have many different tables inside a single database. Now, as you guys can see, I do actually have one table up here, which I created as an example for you guys to see it. And you guys will not have this one. The only thing you guys will see when you do actually click your PHP lessons database is create table, which is this part down here. Now, when it comes to creating tables inside PHPMyAdmin, there's two different ways you can do it. You can do it the easy way, and you can do it the hard way. Now, in our case, we're not going to do it the easy way, because we do actually need to do it the hard way inside our PHP code when we do actually get back to the PHP part, which means that I see no reason for us to actually learn how to do it the easy way and the hard way. So we might as well just do it the hard way. And it's good practice for you guys. So we should do it the hard way, anyways. Now, the way we can actually go ahead, well, let's actually show you guys the example I created here. If I do actually go into the table I created inside my database, you guys can see I do actually have two types of data inside my table. Down here, I do actually have two lines of information. I have a user called Jane23B, which has a password as another password. I also have another user called Danny948A, which has another password as well. Now, each of these users has a unique ID, just so we have, a unique number we can refer to for each of the users. Now, this is an example of a table. And one thing I do want to, point out is that when we have data inside a table, it's going to be split up into columns and rows, meaning that the columns are going to be the IDs, the username, the password, which I created here, and the rows are going to be the data that has been put into the columns. Now, each table is going to have one column which has to be some kind of unique, we call it a primary key, which means that it has to store information that cannot be identical to any of the rows. Meaning that if for example, my user called Jane has an ID as 1, no other user can have the ID as 1 as well. And this is something all tables must have. They must have a primary ID which cannot be identical to any other kind of row. So knowing this, and I know this is already getting a little bit hairy, we're going to go ahead and try and create a table ourselves. And in the next episode, we will actually try creating the actual data that goes inside each table. So let's actually go ahead and click on PHP lessons over here on the left side, so we make sure we're all the way back in the beginning. And now we're going to go up to the SQL tab up here in the top, which is where we're going to create our tables the hard way. Now the easy way would actually be just to go down here and say name and write something and decide how many columns. And let me actually show you guys how this looks like. If I do actually give this table a name, it could be posts, and I could decide, okay, I need 4 columns. I'm going to click go. Now we get this little thing where we have our rows, and well, actually these are going to be our columns, meaning that we can have one column that's, has information regarding topic of the post. It could also be the content of the post, and it could be the date the post was made. And then we can actually decide what type of information, like what type of data it is. Now, even though this is the easy way, like I said, it can be a little bit confusing with all the drop downs, with all the different information we have in here, if you're new at this. So let's actually go ahead and go back by clicking on PHP lessons over here on the left side, and go up to the SQL tab at the very top. Now in here, we can actually go ahead and create SQL code, which will do something with the database. Now, SQL code is a different type of coding language that deals with databases. Now, this is actually the code that you need to know, because you will be using this inside your PHP code as well, which is why we're going to do this the hard way, like I said. So inside the SQL tab here, we can write code. I'm actually going to go ahead and zoom in for you guys a little bit. We're going to go ahead and create the code that creates a table inside our database called PHP lessons. So as long as you click on PHP lessons, we already selected which database to write the code in. So inside the coding field here, we're going to go ahead and say create space table space, and then we need to decide on some kind of name for this table. In our case, we could call this one posts, just because. And then we're going to say parentheses, semicolon. Now I'm going to go ahead and push down my parentheses a little bit, at least, one side of the parentheses, so we can write something in between here. So in between here, we need to write what we need to have inside a column inside our table. And the first column is going to be our primary ID, or like our primary key, it's called. And in this case, we're going to go ahead and call this one ID. I'm going to say space, and then I'm going to go ahead and give it some kind of data type, which there are actually quite a few of, but we're just going to talk about some of the basic ones in this episode. So for the ID, I'm going to go ahead and call this one int, which stands for integer, which is a number. I'm going to say parentheses, and inside the parentheses, we need to tell it how many numbers there can be inside this ID. In our case, I'm just going to write 11, because why not? I don't think we'll ever get to 11, because there's actually quite a few numbers in there. It's 11 numbers after each other. So unless there's like a ton of posts, like millions of posts inside our website, I don't think we're ever going to surpass this. So I'm just going to say 11 for now, space. Then I'm going to go ahead and call this one not null afterwards, which basically means that this one cannot be empty. We need to have a data inside this column, otherwise it's not going to save this information inside the database. Okay, that's basically what not null means. Space, and now we're going to say primary key, capitalized letters. And this means that this is going to be the primary key that no other rows can have the same number as. So now we need to make sure that nobody has the same number as the first person, or like no users or posts has the same ID as each other. And the way we're going to do that is by writing space, and then we're going to say auto underscore increment, which basically means that each time a new post has been made, it will increase our ID by 1, which means that our integer is going to start out at 1. Then when another post come in, it's going to be named number 2 as an ID. And when another post come in, it's going to be named as 3. So it's just going to keep counting upwards, which is going to prevent us from having the same, number inside our ID. Now, after we're done with this column, we're going to write comma. We're going to go down to the next line. And now we can actually start writing the actual information we want regarding the post. So for the first information, we could, for example, say we want a topic. Actually, no, let's say subject instead, because that makes sense. So we have a subject of the post. space. Now, instead of having numbers, because int is just numbers, we want characters inside our subject, meaning that we want something called varchar, like so. Space. Actually, no, well, let's put something inside the parentheses first. Let's actually go ahead and say we want a maximum of 128 characters inside the subject. So if the person actually writes a huge subject line that's more than 128 characters long, it will not save this information, okay? After this, we're gonna go ahead and say not null, comma, next line. That's all we need, because the only reason we have so much written on the first line is because this one is a primary key, and because it's a primary key, we cannot have it repeating itself at any point, which is why we added auto increment. So after this one, we can actually go ahead and just copy paste what we have here to next line, and I'm gonna change subject to content. Now this one is going to be set to varchar as well, but let's actually go ahead and increase the number because the content can actually be pretty long inside a post. Let's go ahead and write 1,000. Again, we also want to have not null. Gonna go down to the next line, and then we're gonna go ahead and say date, because what if we want to have the date when the post was actually made? So after we write date, we're gonna change the data type to something called date time. And then we can actually go ahead and delete our parentheses because we don't actually need that inside date time. Now, what this one does is that it tells us the date in year, month, day, and then the time as hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds, if I remember correctly. And this one is also going to be set as not null. Now, if you guys have questions regarding, how are we going to make sure that the correct type of information goes into these columns, we'll take that at a later point when we do actually start writing the actual stuff. So don't worry about it. For now, let's just go ahead and focus on learning how to create a table. So let's say this is all the information I want regarding a post. Now you want to make sure that the last line does not have a comma behind it, because the comma is only going to be in between each column. And there's no column after this one, so we're just going to go ahead and leave out the comma. After we have this, a good advice for you guys is to actually save or copy this code and paste it inside maybe a blank file here where you can paste it in and save it for a later point. Because maybe you do actually screw something up at some point and you have to delete the table, and instead of having to write everything again, you can just go ahead and paste it in from a document or something. So after we have this, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. We can go ahead and click go down here in the corner. And as you guys can see, MySQL returned an empty result set, which means there was no errors. So after we created this, we can actually go down to our PHP lessons and see we have another table called post. Well, you guys are going to have one table now. I'm going to have one called user as well, just because I created an example. But for you guys, you're going to have one called post. So if you go ahead and click, in the last episode, we talked about how to create a table inside our database, and in this episode, we're going to talk about how to insert data into our table. Now, the way we're going to do this is going to be done the exact same way when we do actually get to the PHP code part later on, where we're going to, for example, create a sign up sheet where people can type something in, sign up on your website, and insert data into the database. Now, the code we're going to write in this episode is going to be the exact same code as you're going to use when we do actually get to do that using PHP code. So it's very important you guys memorize, or at least try to remember the code we're going to write in this episode, because we will actually be using this again. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and take a look at the table we created in the last episode using SQL code, which is called post. And as you guys can see, we have no data inside this table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my PHP lessons, database, the main part of it at least. And then I'm going to go up to my SQL tab. In here, we can write another line of SQL code. So let's pretend for a second that we're inside a forum, inside a website. And we're going to the create post section on this forum where we can actually type something in. It could be, a subject, the content, and the date and that sort of thing. So, well, let's actually take a look at the post structure that we did actually create in the last episode. If I do actually open it up in a new tab here and go to structure, you guys can see we need to have an ID, we need to have a subject, a content, and a date. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to go back to our SQL code writing part, and I'm going to write insert into, and then we need to select the table that we're going to insert data into. In this case, it's going to be post, because we actually created that one in the last episode. So I'm going to write posts, space, parentheses, open and close, space, values, space, parentheses, and we're going to write semicolon at the end here. So now we have the basic setup to actually start inserting data into our table called posts. And the first parentheses we have here is actually going to be the part that tells us, or at least tells the database, which part of the table we're going to insert data into. So as you guys can see, like I said, we have an ID, we have subject, content, and date. Now the ID is actually auto-incremented, which we actually did in the last episode, meaning that it's automatically going to increase itself by 1. So because this one is automatic, we don't actually need to insert data into this one. It does that all by itself. So all we need to worry about when we insert data is the subject, content, and date. So if I go back again, we can actually say, well, the first one is going to be subject, comma, content, comma, and date. So now we can actually go into the values and type in the value we want into our rows when we do, or into the columns called subject, content, and date. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into the values parentheses. I'm going to write single quotes. And inside here, I'm going to write the first piece of data, which is going to be the subject. So let's say we have a post, and the subject of this post could be, this is the subject. Okay, so after this one, we're going to write the content. I'm going to write single quotes. Now I'm going to go ahead and open up a website called lipsum.com, which has a bunch of fill-in text. And this is just random gibberish based on, I think, Latin. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy some random filling text that I'm going to, paste into our content in here, like so. And afterwards, at the very end here, I'm going to go ahead and say comma. And now I need to write the date. Now, when it comes to the date, we did actually decide that we wanted ours as a date time format, as we have down here in the type, which means that we're going to have it as, well, let's actually go ahead and write single quotes first. First, we need to have the year, which is going to be, in our case, 2015, or at least late 2015, dash, and let's say it is the 14th of November. So I'm going to say 11, dash, 14, space. And now we need to write the time, because we did actually say date time format. So right now it is 16:38 where I'm sitting. Like so. Then we need to write the milliseconds as well, which means that it is going to be, I don't know, 01. Doesn't really matter in this case. But now that we have this, we can actually go ahead and submit this. So if I were to just copy it, so we have it copied just for safety. We did actually talk about a separate document in the last episode where we, have all the stuff saved that we did actually insert into the database. Just in case we need to write it again, it would be quite annoying to write all this again. So now I'm going to go ahead and go down here where it says go, going to hit it, and it says one row inserted. So now I can actually go into my post in here, and as you guys can see, we have an ID as 1 because it's automatically going to be inserted. We have a subject, we have the content, and we have a date. So now that we have this, we have one piece of data inside our database. And like I said, the code we just used inside our SQL is going to be the same code we're going to use when we do actually get to insert data inside the code of a website. So when we write our PHP code, we're actually going to be writing SQL code inside our PHP code, which then runs the SQL code from PHP into the database and does something with the database depending on the SQL code we wrote inside the PHP code. So if that sounds a bit confusing right now, don't worry about it. We will actually get to do it. And when we actually do it, it might get a little bit more simple than from what I just said at this moment. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. This is basically what we're going to focus on in this episode. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys next time. Today we're going to talk about how to select stuff inside your database, and this is also going to be very relevant when you do actually get to the PHP part inside your code, where you need to select stuff from the database using PHP code. So what we're going to do here is we're going to make sure we have our database selected, our PHP lessons, and we're going to go back up to the SQL code part. Now, in here, we can actually write all kinds of SQL code that interacts with the database, including selecting specific things from our database. Now, if I go ahead and start writing some code here called select, and then we could actually select maybe subject from, and then we need to tell it which kind of table we want to select something from. So we're going to say posts. If I go ahead and run this now, we're actually going to select all subjects from our posts table. Meaning that if I run this, you guys can see we get subject. This is the subject. And we do actually only have one subject, or like one piece of data inside our table called post, if I show you guys. Which means that we're only going to get one thing when we do actually, select something from this table. Now, we can also go ahead and write something else using SQL code. If I go back here, where we can say select all, by writing star or multiplication or whatever you might call it, space from posts. So now we're actually selecting everything from posts. So if I say go, you guys can see we get the ID, we get the subject, we get the content, and we get the date. So selecting different things from the database might come in handy when, let's say, you're inside your PHP code and you're writing stuff that you need to do on the website. And we have a user that wants to log in into your website, and he goes in and types his username and his password, and then we need to go in and check if that username and password exist inside the same row inside our database. Now, when they do that, we can make a select statement that goes in and checks if this is actually true. If the username is this, then we also need to make sure it has this password, and match them inside the database. So this is the way we're going to select stuff from the database. Now, just to show you guys a couple of more. If we go into the SQL code again, and I want to say select all from post where, and then we can actually go ahead and say ID is equal to, and then I'm going to say single quotes 1. So now I'm going to go ahead and select everything from post, but only where ID is equal to 1. Now, right now, like I said, we do only have one piece of data in here. So right now, ID is of course going to be equal to 1, which means that when we do actually, actually go up and run this piece of code, we will of course get this line of code, which we have inside our post table. But as you guys can see, it does actually highlight with a small yellow orangey line that ID is in fact equal to 1, where we did actually go into selected from. So we can actually go ahead and add these sort of things. Now, just to show you guys one more, if you go back again, write SQL code, we can say select all from posts where ID is equal to 1, and we can actually write and, or we can write or in order to get something out. So now if the ID is equal to 1 and subject is in fact equal to, let's actually say equal to, there we go. This is a subject. If that is correct, let me just go double check. This is the subject. Of course that makes sense. This is the subject. So now it should in fact spit out the same row. If I actually go ahead and copy this, just so I can paste it in later, you can see we get the same row again, but now it's actually checking for both of these, and checking if they're actually true. Now, if I go back again and write in the code again, and I change the text inside my subject, let's say I made a spelling error, and instead of S, we get F. So diff is the subject. Now it's actually going to tell me that there was 0 results because we did not have any where subject was equal to this and ID was equal to this. So if I go back again, paste this in again, we can actually write diff again, and instead of and, we can write or. So now it's checking if ID is equal to 1 or the subject is equal to this, which is, in this case, it's not. So if I go ahead and say go, you can see we still get this row. So this is a couple of ways you can actually select stuff from the database. And again, this is going to be the exact same way we're going to select stuff from the database using PHP code. So learning SQL programming is quite useful if you're learning PHP code, because you will actually be doing a bunch of these commands. Now, in the next episode, we're going to talk about one called update, where we do actually go in and update the database in here. And after that, we've actually pretty much learned the ones I think it's necessary for you guys to learn before we start doing something with PHP code using these SQL commands and actually doing stuff with the database. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys next time. Today we're going to talk about how to update our database using SQL code, and this is going to be the same code you're going to use inside your PHP code to update your database, so try to memorize this if you can. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and select our database, which I do actually have selected here, and then we're going to go to the SQL tab up here in the menu. Inside here, we're going to go ahead and write SQL code that will actually go in and update our table called post. So right now, if you take a look at the table, you guys can see we have an ID, subject, content, and date. Now, let's say I want to change my subject from this is the subject to this is another subject instead. Now, in order to do that, we need to write a piece of SQL code. So I'm going to go ahead and go into my SQL code writing window here, and then I'm going to go ahead and write update space, and then we're going to go ahead and write the name of the table called posts. Then I'm actually going to go ahead and say enter. Now, it doesn't actually matter if you say space and then continue to write here, or if you say enter. I'm only hitting enter because it looks a bit nicer when we type it into the window. So underneath here in the next line, I'm going to go ahead and write set space, and then we need to type what we want to change inside our table called post. So right now, we do actually have a subject. So I'm going to write subject. And now I'm going to set it equal to the new text that I want it to be. So I can actually say this is a test instead. Afterwards, we can either write comma and then say another one if you want to change something else as well. Let's actually go ahead and change our content. So let's actually say content equal to single quotes. And we're going to say this is the content. So now we're actually going to change the huge piece of text we have inside our content area and replace it with this small piece of text. So we can actually keep adding inside our table here, but let's just go ahead and update these two for now. So I'm going to go ahead and say next line, where, and I did actually capitalize this, but it doesn't really matter if you capitalize it or not. It is a habit to actually write all these capitalized when we do actually write code. So when I say update, I write a capitalized, set is capitalized, where is capitalized. It's just a coding habit to do it this way. So it doesn't really matter if you guys want to do it or not. It's still going to work in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and capitalize them for now. After where, we need to select where we want to update this. Or at least we can, if we want to. We can actually just go ahead and delete where and just run it, because it is selecting from post these things in here. But if we do this, and we do actually have many different types of posts inside our table called post, then we're going to change every single one of the posts in there and change the subject and the content of all of them. Now, maybe we don't want that, because let's say we only want to change the post of a certain user who did actually write the post. So let's actually go ahead and say where. And then we're going to say ID is equal to 1. So we're only going to change the post where the ID is equal to 1. So after I run this, well, let's actually go ahead and run this. And you guys will see we get one row affected. Now, if I go down to post, you can see that we do actually have some different content in here. We have this is a test, and this is the content. So now we did actually change the text in here. And that's the basic way updating works inside our database here. So now you guys can see we did actually change the content and the subject. So that's the basic way updating works. Now you can go a little bit more deep into this and it's going to get a little bit more complicated. But for now, this is all you guys need to know in order to do something with PHP code inside a database. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and I'll see you guys next time. Today we're going to talk about how to delete data from our tables using SQL code. And this is also something that you're going to find useful when we write PHP code. In fact, all the SQL code we're going to write inside PHP for these couple of exercises, you will find useful using PHP code. So I'm just going to say it again. You need to memorize these codes because we will be using it in the future. So having said that, let's actually go ahead and make sure we have our PHP lessons database chosen and go into the SQL tab up here in the top. Now in here, we're going to go ahead and delete our information from our post table. As you guys can see, we do actually still have our, our row in here where we have an ID as 1, subject, this is a test, content, this is the content, and then we have a date. So we're going to go ahead and delete this row so we have no rows left inside our database table. So going back to the SQL coding part, let's go ahead and write delete space from space. And then we need to tell it what kind of table we want to delete from. Now in this case, we're deleting from posts. And then I'm going to go ahead and say enter to go to the next line. And again, you could just write space and write where if you wanted to. But just so it looks a bit nicer, I'm going to put it down to the next line. Where, space, and then we need to tell it where we want to delete from. Again, if we do actually have many different types of posts inside our database table, then we might not want to delete all of them because right now this would actually delete everything from post and we don't want that. So let's actually go ahead and delete where ID is equal to 1. So now if I do actually go ahead and run this, you guys can see one row deleted. If I go back into my posts, you guys can see we have no posts left. So this is the basic way to delete stuff inside the database. And in the next episode, we're going to talk about one more thing, which is called order by. And after we talked about that, we'll actually start talking about how to actually do stuff with PHP code to run this SQL code inside the database without having to go into the database and do this. So after we've done that episode, we can actually start talking about creating a login system. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time. Today we're going to talk about a function called order by inside SQL, and this is a way to select something from the database and order it by either alphabetical order or by number, smallest to biggest or biggest to smallest. So what we can do here is we can actually go ahead and go into our database. Now I do actually have some data inside our table called post, I'm going to go ahead and leave this text, or at least the SQL code I wrote to insert this into my database table, inside the description of this video. So you guys can go ahead and copy it in and get this inside your table as well. So after you have this in here, you can actually go ahead and go into your database again, go to the SQL tab, and then we can try to select something and order it by a certain type of data. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and write a select statement. Select all from posts where, actually let's go ahead and not say where, because we do actually want to select everything, you know, all the different rows. So we're going to select everything and say order by instead. And then we're going to go ahead and say that we're going to order it by a certain column. And then we need to tell it if we want it to be ascending or descending. So I'm going to order it by ID. And I'm going to go ahead and order it by ascending, ASC, which means it's going to increase as we start spitting it out. So if I do actually, you know, run this, let me actually go ahead and copy it first. You guys should do that as well. You guys can see we get two pieces of data, well, two rows of data. We get one where the ID as 1 is at the very top and the ID as 2 is at the bottom. Now, if we go back in here, write the code again, and I change ascending to descending by writing DESC, run it. You guys can see that now we do actually have number 2 at the top and number 1 at the bottom. So now we change the order where we did actually spit it out. So we can also go back again and paste it in one more time. And this time we're going to go ahead and order it by subject. Now, if I order it by subject, it's not going to count the numbers, of course, because it's not an integer. It is in fact text we have inside the subject. But now it's going to take it after the alphabet, meaning that A is going to come out first and Z is going to be the last one. So if I do actually go ahead and do this by ascending, well, right now our our subject does actually have the exact same thing, but because we have subject 1, it's going to look at, okay, everything is the same, all the text is the same, and then when it hits the first character where there's something that comes first, then it's going to spit that out first. So subject 1 is actually going to be at the very top here. So if we do actually go back again, paste it in, and say we want to order it by descending, and of course not by ID, we want to order it by our subject. Now you guys will see it changed again, because subject is in fact a string, and 2, even though that's a number, is part of the string, which is going to come after 1, of course, and because it's descending, it's going to be the first one that gets spit out. So this is the basic way we can order something inside a database. And there's actually one more thing that we could talk about, which is called group by. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and leave that one. You guys can go ahead and look it up on Google. It's not, well, later on it might become relevant, but for now, when we do actually want to create a login system, it's not very relevant. So we're just going to go ahead and leave it at this. And in the next episode, we're going to start talking about how to actually write PHP code and use SQL code inside our PHP code. So in the previous episodes, we talked about how to create a database and how to insert and manipulate data inside a database. Now in this episode, we're going to learn how to actually access our database directly from our websites. So as you guys can see in front of me here, I have a very basic index.php file. This is like the bare bones of an index file. And what I want to show you guys is how to actually connect to the database. And then in the next episodes, we're going to talk about how to actually select data and how to insert data and how to manipulate the database directly from our website. So the first thing we need to do here is we're going to create a new file, because we want to have the connection in a separate file so we can refer to it later on inside our code. So inside my new document here, I'm going to go ahead and create the PHP tags. So we have a opening tag. Now I get asked quite often, because usually when I have a pure PHP file like this one, I don't put in the closing tags. And that's because since we only have PHP code inside this file, it's just a common habit of programmers to just leave out the closing tag, since the only thing this one does is to close off the PHP code and then allow for us to write other code afterwards. Now, since this is a pure PHP file, I'm just going to leave this one out. So inside the code here, I'm going to go ahead and first of all include 4 parameters we need in order to connect to the database, which is going to be the server name, the username, the password, and the database name for our database. So the first one here is going to be a variable that says db server name, like so, and it's going to be equal to the actual server name of our database. Now I'm going to save this just so we can get the colors that we want inside the code. So I'm going to save it inside my root folder, inside a folder called includes. So I'm just going to go ahead and right click first, create a new folder, call this one includes. Now the reason I'm doing this is because inside my main directory of my root folder, I have my index file, which is an actual page inside my website. Now, just to make this a little bit neat, and this is not something you have to do, it's just a common habit that I like to do inside my websites, is that I like to create a folder called something like includes or additional files or something that has all the code inside of it that is not seen directly inside the website, but has scripts that runs in the background of the website. So inside my includes folder, I'm going to save this file as dbh, which stands for database handler, .inc.php. And now again, I have people asking me, why do I include .inc inside the file name? Now, this is just naming, okay? This is just for naming purposes. This does absolutely nothing technically. So if I were to delete the inc, you could just do like dbh.php if you want to. It does the exact same thing. We could also go ahead and write -inc if you wanted to. You can do all sorts of things with the naming. I just decided that .inc sounds better. So I'm going to say dbh.inc.php. I'm going to save it. And now we can actually get the colors that we want inside the code. So after we have the 2 double quotes, I'm going to write a semicolon. And inside the double quotes, we're going to write the name of our server. Now, because right now I'm using a localhost server, which is using XAMPP. If you're using an online server, you need to change the name, but because I'm using a local server, I need to write localhost. So if you guys are following the exact, same XAMPP program that we use to actually get the server running, then you also need to write localhost. Now the next name is going to be the database username. So I'm going to say db, well, first of all, we need to create a variable called db username. And this one, if you're using XAMPP, is going to be equal to root, R-O-O-T. Now, this should only be changed if you are on an online server, because you will have a different username for your database. This should also be changed if you, by yourself, actually change the username and the password inside your localhost database. So as a default, XAMPP is going to be root. Inside the next variable, which is going to be variable db password, I'm going to set a password equal to nothing. Now that again is a default inside XAMPP, that when you install it as a default, it's going to have no password. If you created a password inside XAMPP when you installed it, then you need to change it. If you are using an online server, you also need to change the password inside the actual code we're writing here. So you need to include the proper password for your online database. Inside the next line, we're going to include the database name. So I'm going to say we have a variable called db name, which is equal to double quotes, semicolon. And inside the double quotes, I'm going to write the name of our database. Now, in my case here, I decided to create a database called login system, because in a couple of episodes from now, we will be talking about how to create a login system from scratch using PHP code. So I'm going to call my database login system. And again, you can call whatever you want. It depends on what you created inside your database inside PHPMyAdmin. Okay. Now that we have the 4 parameters we need to actually get the database connection running, I'm going to include a variable called con, which stands for connection. It's going to be equal to a PHP function called MySQL underscore connect, parentheses, semicolon. And inside the parentheses, we need 4 parameters. And guess what? We just included those 4 parameters up here, so we can just put them inside the parentheses. So I'm just going to paste in, first of all, the server name, the username, the password, and a database name. Now, the reason we decided to write the variables in this order up here is because that's the order that you need to include them inside your connect parentheses down here. So you need to have the server name first, then the username, then the password, and then the database name, okay? So now that we have this, we can actually go ahead and create the actual connection to this file inside, for example, our index file. Now, typically we would actually include the connection inside some kind of PHP script that needs to access the database to, for example, insert or pull out data from the database. But just to show you guys how to actually get, this access to the database using this file, I'm going to use the index file. So let's say I have some PHP code inside my body tag down here where we need to select data from the database. What I'm going to do is I'm going to include the database connection at the very top. So I'm going to say we open up the PHP tags. And then I'm going to write include underscore once, single quotes, semicolon. And then I'm just going to go ahead and include the path to this file. So I'm going to say it's inside a includes folder because that's the way I decided to do it, /. And then I'm going to say dbh.inc.php. So now we have access to the variable up here called variable con, which is the connection to our database. So if I were to actually connect to the database inside my PHP code in the later episodes, a couple episodes from now, when I show you guys how to pull out or insert data directly from the website, if you want to access the database, we just need to refer to variable con inside our code. So that's the way we actually connect to the database. And this file here is everything we need to actually do that. So hope you guys enjoyed. In the next episode, we'll talk about how to actually show data from a database. In the last episode, we talked about how to actually connect to a database, and in this episode, we're going to learn how to actually select data from inside the database we connected to. So as you guys can see, I started off from the previous episode where we just simply included a database connection inside our dbh.inc.php file. And we're going to use this connection in order to actually go into the database and select data and then spit it out inside our website. So inside my index file, I included my database connection at the top here. So we actually have access to variable con. And inside the index file, inside the body tag, I'm going to go ahead and include a piece of code that goes into the database, selects a piece of data, and spits it out. So before we get started, I'd like to show you guys what exactly I did inside my database. So inside PHPMyAdmin, I created a database called login system, because that's what I connected to inside my DBH file called login system. And inside this database, I went ahead and created a table called users, which we're going to use when we create the login system a couple of episodes from now. And inside this users table, I haven't actually included any kind of users yet, so we can actually go and do that together. So inside the description of this video, inside YouTube, you guys can find a link to my lesson files for this lesson. And inside those lessons files, I will have a document called databasecode.sql. And inside this file, you can actually find the SQL code that I used in order to actually create the table called users, and the insert statement that we're going to use in order to actually insert a user inside the users table. So I'm going to copy the code from the bottom here called insert into users, blah, 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 that will actually insert a user inside this table up here. So I'm going to go inside my login system database. I'm going to SQL at the top here. I'm going to paste in the code, and I'm just going to go ahead and include another user. So we have two of them inside the database. I'm just going to change the information of the second one. So it's not Daniel. Instead, we can say Jane Doe, and we can change the actual email to just jane@gmail.com. We're going to change the username from admin to Jane245A or something. We're going to change the password to test1234 just to have something. I'm going to go ahead and run this code. And as you guys can see, now that I go inside my users table, we now have 2 users inside this table here. Okay, so one thing to bear in mind that I want to point out is that inside my table, the first row or the first column inside the table is called user ID. Now the user ID, when I created the table, if you go back to the code, is set to auto increment. And because it's auto incremented, we don't actually need to insert any kind of data inside this column here. So that's why we're not actually inserting into user underscore ID. Okay. So now that we have 2 users inside the database, I can actually go back inside my website that has nothing inside of it right now. And we can actually go ahead and write the code that will select the data we just inserted inside the database. So inside my body tags here, since we already have the connection up here, I'm going to write the PHP tags. So we can actually write PHP code. And inside of here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the actual data using a SQL statement. So I'm going to go ahead and say we have a variable called SQL. I'm going to set it equal to double quotes, semicolon. Now inside the double quotes, I'm going to write one of the SQL statements we learned in one of the previous episodes called select. So you guys should know how to actually do this by now. So I'm going to write select, then I'm going to select everything from users, because that's the name of the table. Then I'm going to go ahead and say, well, let's actually just go ahead and do this. Then I'm going to say semicolon. Now you might be asking, why do I include a semicolon when we have a semicolon? Because some people have been writing me about that. Now, when it comes to using SQL code inside PHP code, right now we should only look at this code as what is inside the double quotes. So right now, if I were to actually write code inside my database, for example, like we did here with the insert statement, you guys will notice that there's a semicolon at the end of the SQL code. So that's something that we need to do inside SQL. And that's why inside the SQL statement inside the PHP code, I also include a semicolon at the end here. So this semicolon outside is the PHP semicolon, and the semicolon that inside is the SQL semicolon. Okay? Now that we have the actual SQL statement we want to insert inside the database that will actually do something and return something to us, we need to actually query this code. And it's actually called querying the code. We want to send it to the database and run it inside the database. So the way we do this is by creating another variable. We're going to call this one result. I'm going to set it equal to a PHP function called MySQL underscore query, parentheses, semicolon. And then we need to go inside the parentheses, and the first parameter in here, there's going to be 2. The first one is going to be the actual connection to the database, which we included inside dbh.inc.php, which is right here, variable con. So I'm going to copy this variable, which we have access to because I linked to it up here, and insert it as the first parameter. Then the second parameter is going to be the actual SQL statement we want to actually query inside the database, which is the one we just wrote here, like so. And now we'll actually go in and fetch the results. But now we need to actually take the data that we got from the database and be able to actually spit it out inside our website. So the way we do that is, well, first of all, we could actually check if we had any kind of results. So I'm going to create a variable called result check if you wanted to. This is optional. I recommend you do it though, because if you don't get any kind of results from the database, you're going to get an error message inside your website. So it's a good idea to check for this sort of thing. So we're going to say result check is equal to MySQL underscore num underscore rows, parentheses, semicolon. And then I'm going to insert the query that we just ran inside the database and put it inside the parentheses. So it just takes one parameter. So now that we have the actual result number, we can actually go ahead and check if we have a result above 0. So in the next line, I'm going to create an if statement that says if we have result check and it's actually greater than 0, then do whatever is inside the curly brackets. So right now, if we did actually have any kind of result from the database when we want to select something, then it's going to run this code inside the curly brackets. So if we got no results, it's not going to do anything here, okay? So inside the if statement, we can actually go ahead and say, okay, now we got some kind of result. So now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and spit out the data. Now, if I were to create an if statement that says, if we have data, then spit it out, then we're only going to spit out the first data from inside the database. Now, because I selected everything from the users table, I would like to keep spitting out data as long as we have results. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go and change the if statement to a while loop that will actually keep spitting out data as long as I have data inside the database. Now inside the while loop condition, I'm going to include a variable called row, which is going to be set equal to a PHP function called MySQL underscore fetch underscore assoc, which is going to fetch all the results from the result we have up here. So we're going to insert the variable result inside the parentheses, and it's going to assign it equal to $row. So basically what's going on here is we get all the data from the database, and we insert each row of data inside $row as an array. So because $row becomes an array with all the data from the database, the way we include it or the way we echo it out inside the website is the same way as an array. So if I were to go inside the while loop here and actually say I want to spit out, for example, the username from the users, I'm going to say echo space $row, and then the way we would actually echo out data from an array is by using brackets. And inside the brackets, I'm going to say single quotes. Usually inside an array, we could actually say 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 because we want to get out the first or the second or the third data inside the array. But because when we assign the data inside $row, each data result will actually get a name assigned to it, which is going to be equal to the columns inside the database. Meaning that right now, if I want to fetch the data from inside $row, I need to actually write the name of the column we want to access, which is a really neat feature if we want to access data results easily without getting confused about which data we're actually spitting out. So inside the brackets, if I want to get the username, I just simply write user underscore UID, which is the column name for the actual username. And then I can go to the website and actually see what happens here. So now you guys can see we get admin and we get Jane245A, which is the usernames of the actual users. I could actually go ahead and include a break right next to the code here just so we can see exactly what's going on. So we're going to say break like so, and then we can actually see the names easier. So this is how we can actually access data from inside the database using PHP code. Of course, there's other variations of how we can Today we're going to learn how to insert data inside our database directly from our website using PHP code. And as you guys can see in front of me here, I have the same code as we did in the previous episode where we learned how to select data from inside the database. And that's because we're going to use basically the same code in order to do the same thing when we want to insert data inside our database. So as you guys can see in front of me here, I have all the same code inside the index file. I have the database connection inside my DBH file. And I will also include the database code to our actual database inside databasecode.sql. Now, if you guys don't have these files and you want to get access to them, maybe because you didn't watch the previous episode, you can go ahead and download these files in the description so you can actually follow this lesson. So just for the sake of it, let's actually go ahead and go through the code from the previous episode. So the basic thing we have here is the database connection at the top of our index file, so we can actually get access to the database, which is in here. And inside the body tags, we just simply wrote a SQL statement that will actually, do something with the database. And then the next line, we just simply query this SQL statement so it actually does something to the database using the connection we have down here. And then on the next line, we just simply check if we had any kind of results from this select statement. If we did not have a result, it's not going to run the if statement down here. Now, if we did actually have a result, it's going to run a while loop that will actually assign all the data to variable row and spit it out inside our website. So when we want to insert data instead of selecting data, what we're basically going to do is we're going to go and delete this if statement here. we're going to delete the result check, like so. So we only have these 2 lines of code. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the select statement. And what I'm going to change it to is the insert statement I have inside my database code file here called databasecode.sql. I'm just going to go ahead and word wrap this for you so you can actually see everything. So I'm basically just going to copy this code we have here, go back inside my SQL statement inside my index file and paste it in here and save it. And that's basically how we insert data inside the database. So just to explain what exactly is going on here, basically we just have an insert statement that I insert instead of the select statement. And then below here, we just simply say we want to run a MySQL I_query function that simply queries this code and does something with it inside the database. Now, since we're not selecting anything, we basically just need to run the code, and then it simply creates the user called Daniel Nielsen, blah, 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 and puts him inside the database. So basically, we don't actually need to have the variable here. We just need to actually run this function down here called MySQL_query, and this will actually work. So this is basically how we can insert data into our database directly from our website using PHP code. But I know some of you people will ask me, how do we actually use this inside a practical example? Because right now, I just sort of hand wrote the data inside the single quotes in here. How do we actually do something inside a website that will insert data from, for example, a form into the database? Let's actually go ahead and go inside the body tag and I'll show you how to do this. I'm going to go ahead and create a form. And inside this form, I'm going to create a couple of inputs. So we're going to say we have an input called text. We're going to have a name for this input. This one is going to be, at least the first one, is going to be the first name of the person. We're going to have a placeholder called first name. And again, this is just basic HTML code, so you guys should know how to do this by now. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste this input statement a couple of times. So we have, for all the inputs we need to have inside our insert statement. So we need one for the first name, one for the last name, one for the email, one for the username, and one for the password. Now for the password one, I'm going to go and change the type to password. I'm going to change the names of all of them. So we have the second one up here called last, which is last name. Going to change the placeholder to last name. I'm never actually sure if this is one word or 2 words because English is not my native language, but I'm just going to go ahead and write it one word. The third one is going to have a email. So we're going to write email as the name. We're going to write e-mail as the placeholder. Inside the fourth one, we're going to write the username. So it's called UID, which is what I usually call a username. And then we're going to write username inside the placeholder. And again, this is basically if you want to create a user for example, a website. Inside the last one, we're going to write PWD for the password. And then inside the placeholder, password. Like so. Now, just for the heck of it, let's actually go ahead and include a break in between each one of them, because I know once we do actually get inside the website, it's actually going to spit these out on one line, and I want them on separate lines. So I'm just going to go ahead and include a break here. I'm going to go ahead and include a button at the end because we need to actually click something to actually activate this form. So I'm going to say sign up, which I think is 2 words in English. Inside the button tag, I'm going to go ahead and include a type set to submit. So it actually registers that we submitted this form. I'm going to set a name equal to submit. Now, the reason I'm including a name inside the button is because once I do actually want to check if the user clicked this button, I want to use the name in order to actually check for the submit. I'll show you guys in a second. Now, some of you people ask me, what about required, the attribute called required inside the inputs? Why do we not just include those using HTML? If we want to make sure that the person actually filled out all these fields, because the way we would typically do it is using PHP code, we would actually go ahead and check if the user did actually type in everything inside the inputs. Well, when it comes to writing code in HTML or JavaScript or jQuery, if I were to write the required attribute inside the inputs using HTML, we can actually get around it inside the developer tool inside most browsers. So it's not entirely secure when we use required inside HTML. So we don't want to do it only the HTML way. We actually want to do it the PHP way or with some other kind of backend language because it's much safer. Okay. So now that we have this, we can actually go ahead and go inside the form tag and say, okay, once I hit the submit button, I want to run some kind of PHP code. Now the PHP code right now is actually down here, but I want to create a separate file and insert this code inside that file in order to actually run that script once I click the button, because right now it's just going to run this code as soon as I refresh the browser, and I don't want to do that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and set an action, which is going to be the path to the actual file that I want to run once we do actually click the submit button. Now inside my root folder, I have a index file, I have the database code you guys can use if you want to copy my code from the database, and I have an includes folder. Now inside this includes folder, I have my database connection, and like I said in the previous episode, all the code that goes inside the includes folder, for me at least, is going to be code that is not a direct page inside the website, but instead just some PHP code that gets run in the background that we don't actually physically see inside the website. So I'm going to go and include a path to a file that we haven't actually created yet inside the includes folder called, well, we're going to say includes because we need to point to the file or to the folder. And inside this folder, we have a signup.inc.php file, which again, like I said, we haven't actually created yet. Let's actually go ahead and make sure we write that correctly, like so. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and include a method. So we need to actually decide how secure do we want this information to be when we do actually send it to our signup.inc.php file. Right now, we're going to do that using a method attribute, which is going to be set equal to a post method, since when we use the post method, we can actually see the data inside the URL. So if we were to use a get method, we could actually see the data. But because this data is more sensitive, because we have passwords and that sort of thing, I want to use a post method. Okay, so what we need to do now is we could actually go ahead and copy this code down here, then delete it, and insert it inside a new file, save it inside the includes folder as signup.inc.php, like so. So now when we do actually run this file, we will actually include a user inside the database. But wait, once we do actually click the form button and go into this file, it will not take us back to the front page, and we need to fix that. So inside this file, we're going to go ahead and go to next line. I'm going to say we have a header function inside PHP, which simply takes us to another file. So once it has actually run this code up here, it's going to take us to the front page again. So I'm going to say we have double quotes, location, colon, space, .. / because it needs to take us back a directory because I'm inside my includes folder. And then it's going to load index.php. And we could actually include some kind of success message. So we're going to say question mark, sign up is equal to success, if you wanted to. Now, the last thing we need to include inside this file is right now, because I copy pasted this code inside a new document, right now we don't actually have access to our database connection. So I need to go back to the front page and say we have this include once database connection, copy it, and then just delete it because we don't actually need it inside the front page anymore. Go back to the sign up page and include it at the very top here. So now we do actually have access to variable con, which we need to have access to in order to actually connect to the database. So now that we have this, we could actually go back to the front page, refresh, and as you guys can see, we now have a form with a couple of inputs and then a button. Now what is going to happen now is if I were to actually click the sign up button, it's going to go ahead and run the code inside signup.inc.php. Now, right now, since we haven't modified our insert statement yet, it's just going to create a user called Danny Nielsen, blah, 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 inside the database, but it's not going to take the information we typed in inside the input fields. So we need to change that. So inside my signup.inc.php file, right after we have the included database connection, I'm going to create a couple of variables. So I'm going to go ahead and say we have a variable called first, which is the first name. It's going to be equal to $_post, brackets. Now this post variable here is a super global, which simply takes the data we passed on from the form into this document, and it's going to assign it equal to variable first. Okay. Now the name of the super global post is going to be equal to, if we were to go back to the form here, equal to the name that we assigned the input. So if we want to get the data from this input, we need to refer to the one with the name first. So I'm going to copy this name, go back to the post superglobal, paste in the name, and then simply copy this statement a couple of times because we need to get all the other results as well, which were, I think, about 5 of them. We're going to change the second one to last because that's the last name. We're going to change the third one to email. The fourth one is going to be changed to UID, and the last one is the password. Now, again, right now there's no security for this password. It has not been hashed or anything when we insert it into the database. I know some people will actually comment on that. This is just a very, very basic sign-up form, okay? So now that we have all this data, we can actually go ahead, copy the first name, go down to the SQL code down here, and paste in variable first. So I'm just going to do that for all of them. Instead of the last name, Nilsson, I'm just going to paste in last. Instead of the email, I'm going to copy in variable email. And we're just going to continue doing this till we have everything filled out. Like so. So now that we pasted in all the variables inside our insert statement, there's one more thing we need to fix. Because right now I just included the database connection, but because we're already inside the includes folder, I need to delete the include part inside the path. So we just need to reference to dbh.inc.php without the includes path, okay? So now that we have this, we're basically ready to actually test this out. So I'm gonna go back inside the website, gonna refresh, and then I'm gonna go ahead and type in some information inside the form and then click sign up, because now we'll actually take the information from the form and use it inside the insert statement. So I'm gonna write John Doe, email could be john@gmail.com. I'm going to go ahead and set a username as John Doe. I'm going to set the password as test. Then when I click sign up, you guys can see we get this path in the URL that says sign up equal to success. And now if we were to actually go inside the database and zoom out a little bit for you guys, right now we have 2 users inside the database. One is called Daniel and one is called Jane. If we were to actually refresh the table, you guys can see that now we have John Doe. So this is how we can actually insert data directly from our website using something like a form. Hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you guys next time. In the last couple of episodes, we learned how to select data inside a database and how to insert data inside a database. Now, when it comes to inserting data inside any kind of database, we need to make sure that we do this in a safe way to make sure nobody can go into your database and destroy it or read the data we have inside the database. So far inside these lessons here, we've been using something called procedural programming, which means that when we want to use PHP code, we just simply inside our code, write the PHP code and use it wherever we need to use it. And when we use PHP code the procedural way, there's 2 methods we can use in order to make it safe for people to insert data inside our database. Now, when I talk about it being safe, I'm talking about people that goes to your website, like the one we did in the previous episode where we talked about how to insert data from your website. So what essentially they'll do is inside our browser here, they'll actually go into your form, start writing information, but in one of these inputs, they'll start writing code, which then gets sent to your database and seen as code. And we don't want people to be able to do this inside our website because they could essentially say that they want to create something or destroy something inside our database directly from our website. So we need to make sure we don't allow people to do this directly inside the website. So like I said, when it comes to procedural programming, there's 2 methods we can use inside PHP. Now the first one here I'm going to show you guys, which we're just going to focus on this episode, is a method where we go in and get the data that the user typed in inside the form, and then escape the characters to make sure that the database only sees the text as text and not as actual code. So when we do actually have the form inside our index file, which we created in the previous episode, and send the data to our signup.inc.php file, then we want to do something in between here, which escapes the text that the user typed in and then makes it into characters. Okay, so inside our signup.inc.php file, we did actually get all the data from the previous form inside the index page by creating variables and set them equal to the actual data. So what we're going to go and do is after the first variable, which is called first, after the equal sign, we're going to say we have a PHP function called MySQL underscore real underscore escape underscore string parentheses. Now inside the parentheses, we need to have two different parameters. The first one is going to be the database connection to our database. And the second parameter is going to be the actual data that the user passed on from the form. So inside the parentheses, we're going to go ahead and say we have a variable called variable con, which is the connection we have inside our database connection over here. So our actual database connection line is equal to variable con. So just simply include that inside as parameter 1. Then we're going to say comma, space, and then we're just going to go ahead and take the data from the previous form and just paste it inside the second parameter. I'm going to go ahead and save this one. And now what we basically just need to do is copy paste this inside the rest of the variables underneath here. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy, paste, 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 and paste, as well as getting the last part of the actual function and pasting them as well. So right now we just escaped all the different characters we have inside the code that the user passed on from the previous form to make sure the database doesn't see this as code. And just to point out what I mean when I say that the database is going to see this as code if we don't do this, if I were to type some kind of SQL code inside my website here, and then it gets passed on to our code and insert inside the SQL statement we have down here. If I were to go inside one of the values here, where we have variable first would actually get replaced by whatever we have inside variable first up here, which means that whatever it's equal to. And if I were to write code, it means that the variable first is equal to some kind of SQL code. So basically what just happens inside the SQL statement is that it replaces variable first with actual SQL code, where we can actually go ahead and close off this statement and write a new statement if we want to, and say it has to maybe destroy a table called users if we want to do that, and then all the users inside your database will be deleted, and we don't want to do that. So to make sure that doesn't happen, we need to make sure we escape the characters inside our code. Okay, you should never take the post statement directly and insert it inside your values down here. Okay, because if we do that, we don't get a chance to escape the characters. So we just talked about how to escape characters using MySQL. But when it comes to procedural PHP coding, there's actually another way, which is called prepared statements, which is actually much safer to use. And depending on what you need to do with the database, it can also be much faster to actually do than using MySQL. Now in the next episode, I'm going to show you guys how to actually do prepared statements using PHP programming when it comes to procedural programming. And then in a later episode, it's my plan to create a login system with you guys who can actually start using the stuff we learned inside these lessons here to actually build something you can use inside a website. Now, when we build this login system, it's not going to be built using prepared statements in the first episode, because prepared statements can, for newer people, be a bit tough to understand. So when we do actually get to login system tutorial, I will be showing you guys how to do it using MySQL to begin with. And then in the episode afterwards, I'm going to show you guys how to replace it with prepared statements. Okay? I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time. In the last episode, we learned how to protect our database when a user goes to your website and inserts data directly from your website into the database. And the reason we need to do this is because it's actually possible for people to go to your website, and when you allow for them to actually write something themselves that then gets sent to the database, is that we allow for people to actually write code which will then get read by the database, and we actually allow for people to mess up the database. So the user could potentially go into a database and delete or change or see things that they shouldn't see inside the database. So we need to make sure we protect the database inside our website from what's called SQL injection, which is when people do actually go into a website and write something inside an input, like inside a form, and sends code inside your database. Now in the previous episode, we talked about how to protect the database by using MySQL, which is what we did right here by using the MySQL function inside PHP. Now there's a much better way we can do this, which is not using MySQL, by using something called prepared statements. Now the idea behind prepared statements is that when we have some kind of SQL statement like the one we have down here, we can actually go in and say, well, we don't know what the data is actually going to be yet, which means we're going to go ahead and add placeholders instead of the actual variables down here. We then send the SQL code to the database to actually parse it, which means we're actually going to run the code inside the database. And then afterwards, later on, we send the actual data to the database and replace the placeholders inside our SQL statements. And because when we do actually send the data later on, we use a different protocol inside the database won't actually read the placeholders as code inside the database, it's just going to see it as characters. Now today, prepared statements is actually seen as the preferred method when you do actually connect to a database and either need to see stuff or insert stuff into the database. So once you do actually start making websites that need to actually be uploaded online, then it's recommended that you do actually use prepared statements, okay? Now what we're going to go ahead and do in this episode is, first of all, I'm going to go and show you guys how to use prepared statements when it comes to selecting data inside the database. And then afterwards, I'm going to show you guys how to do it when we want to insert data inside the database. So a couple of episodes ago, we talked about how to select data directly from the website, which I believe was the first episode where we did actually do anything inside the actual website that had anything to do with the database. So if you guys want the lesson files from that previous episode, I recommend you guys go back a couple episodes to where we do actually learn how to select data directly from the website, and download the lesson file so you guys can actually follow this lesson here if you guys want to. So this is the file that we had a couple of episodes ago, where we just simply inside the index file went in, selected data, and spit it out inside the website. And what we did here is we just selected everything from inside the users table and spit out the username of every single user. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and say we want to select a specific user inside the database. What we're going to do first here is we're going to go ahead and say we have a select statement that selects everything from users where user underscore UID is equal to a specific name. So right now inside my database, if we were to take a look at it, you guys can see that right now I have just one user inside the database called admin. Now I want to select admin inside my website. So what we could do here is inside the select statement, say we want to select a user ID called single quotes admin. So we were to save this and then refresh the browser, you guys should see that we get admin. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to say that, well, we want to include a placeholder instead of the actual name of the user we want to select from the database. So I'm going to go ahead and say question mark. And then afterwards, I'm just going to go ahead and delete everything we have in here except for the while loop down inside our check down here. So I'm just going to delete everything except for the while loop. And then we're going to go ahead and replace all this code with prepared statements instead of using MySQL, which is what we used before. Okay, so underneath the SQL statement, and we can actually go ahead and write a comment here just so we know exactly what's going on. I'm going to go ahead and say that we just created a template, which we'll then use later on when we do actually have the actual data that it needs to insert instead of the placeholder. So we're going to say we just created a template. And then after we create the template, we need to actually create the prepared statement. So what we're going to do is we're going to say we have a comment that says create a prepared statement, which I'm going to go ahead and say is a variable called stmt, which stands for statements. I'm going to set it equal to a PHP function called MySQL underscore stmt underscore init, which stands for initialize. So basically what we're starting up here is a prepared statement. Now, right now inside this prepared statement here, we need to tell it which connection we want to use to actually do this inside the database. So what we do actually have is inside our DBH file, we have a connection to the database called variable con. So I'm going to go ahead and say we want to use this connection inside our statement down here. So I'm going to go ahead and paste it inside as a parameter inside the function. So after creating the prepared statement, I'm going to go underneath here. And now we need to actually prepare the prepared statement using the SQL statement we have up here, the template. So I'm going to go ahead and say we want to prepare the prepared statement. And we do that using another PHP function called MySQL underscore stmt underscore prepare. Now, before we actually continue, we can actually go ahead and create a check here that checks if this prepared statement can actually work using the SQL statement we have up here, or using the template that we created beforehand. So what I can do here is I can actually go ahead and say we have an if statement. And inside the condition of the if statement, I'm going to insert my function down here called MySQL underscore statement underscore prepare, insert it inside of here. And then inside the parameters of this function, I can actually go ahead and insert the statement that we created previously. So I'm going to insert it as the first parameter. And then the second parameter is going to be the actual SQL template that we created up here. So I'm going to paste it in as parameter number 2. So now what we just did here is we went ahead and said, okay, if this function here does actually succeed, it should go ahead and run the code inside the if statement. Now, when it comes to PHP code, we want to always check for failure before we check for success. So what I'm going to go ahead and do here is I'm going to go ahead and insert a exclamation mark right before the function, which now means that instead of checking if it succeeds, we now check if it failed. So if this does actually fail, we should write some kind of message inside the if statement. So we could actually echo some kind of string that says SQL statement failed, just so we know what actually happened if we were to actually fail using this SQL statement. Okay, so afterwards we want to say, well, we have an if statement, then else, if this actually succeeded, then we want to run the code inside the else statement. So now what we did so far is we did actually create the template, we did actually create a prepared statement using the connection to the database, and then afterward we prepared the prepared statement using the template. So what we want to do now is we want to actually bind the parameters we want to replace with the placeholders inside the template. And we do that by going inside the else statement. We create a comment called bind parameters to the placeholders, or holders, since we only have one in here. And underneath here, we're going to go ahead and create a PHP function called MySQL underscore stmt underscore bind underscore param, which stands for parameters, parentheses, semicolon. And inside the parentheses, we need to have a couple of different parameters. Now, the first one is going to be the actual statement that we prepared up here called stmt. So we're going to go ahead and say we have variable stmt, comma, space. Then the second parameter is going to be an indicator for the placeholder we insert inside the template up here. So right now we have a question mark instead of the actual data. So what I'm going to do is inside as the second parameter, I'm going to say double quotes, and then I'm going to go ahead and write s, which means that right now we only have one placeholder inside the statement. If I were to have a second placeholder, such as if I were to also check if user underscore first, which is the first name, was equal to question mark, and again, we would also add something like and in between here. Then right now we would actually check for two different factors inside our database. We would check for the username and the first name. So right now we do actually have two different placeholders. In that case, we would actually add a second s inside the double quotes. Now in this episode, we're not going to go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete what I just wrote here, but just to show you guys, we would actually do that. Now the third parameter inside this function here is going to be the actual data that we want to insert instead of the placeholder up here. Now we haven't actually created that data yet, because in some cases, like inside a typical website, we could actually allow for people to write something and then search for it inside the database. But because right now we just want to select some kind of user using some kind of name, I'm going to create a variable at the very top here, which I'm going to call data, just to give it some kind of name. I'm going to set it equal to double quotes, which is a string called admin. So right now data is equal to admin, which is the name we want to search for inside the database, or the username that we want to search for. So I'm going to set this s down here, which right now represents the placeholder inside the SQL statement. I'm going to say we want to replace it with this variable data we created up here by saying that the third parameter is going to be variable data. Now, if we were to have two different placeholders and we did actually have the second s, the way we would do this is we would actually create a fourth parameter, which would then be equal to whatever variable we created for the second parameter or the second placeholder inside the statement here, okay? But right now, because we just have one, I'm just going to include one inside the parameters down here. So now that we did this, we can actually execute the actual statement inside our database. So essentially what we're actually doing here is we're saying that we have this SQL statement, we then run it inside the database, and after it's been passed inside the database, we then include the actual data that needs to be used instead of the placeholders. So underneath here, what we're going to go ahead and say is that we want to actually run this SQL statement, but using the parameters we gave it down here. And the way we're going to do that is, first of all, let's actually go ahead and create a comment that says run parameters inside database. Then we're going to go ahead and say we have a PHP function called MySQLi underscore stmt underscore execute parentheses. And then inside the parentheses, we just need to include the statement that we just prepared, like so, which means that right now we actually ran this line of code, which had all the data inside we need to replace inside the placeholders inside the database. Now, after doing this, we still need to get the actual data. So underneath here, what we're going to go ahead and say is we want to take the results from the executed statement and insert them inside a variable. So right now we want to say we have a variable called result, which is equal to a PHP function called MySQLi underscore stmt underscore get underscore result. Parentheses, semicolon. Then inside the parentheses, we need to actually get the data from inside the statement we just prepared. And then after we do this, we can actually take the while loop that we had down here and just simply put it inside our else statement, like so. So right now we just did the exact same thing as we did in the previous episode. We just went in and selected data, but instead we did it using prepared statements, which is much safer to use inside a website. So just to go ahead and check what we did in here, if I were to refresh the browser, you guys can see we still get admin inside our browser. Now we'll actually go back inside the code and say we want to search for not admin, but John, because we don't have that inside the database. You guys will notice that we don't get any kind of results. So what we want to do now is, now that we learned how to actually select data from inside the database, now we want to actually insert data inside the database. So in order to do this, I'm going to go ahead and use the lesson material from the previous episode where we learned how to insert data inside the database, which is right after the episode where we learned how to select data. So if you guys are interested, you can just go ahead and go back to that episode and download the lesson files if you want to follow this lesson here. Now, when it comes to inserting data inside a database using prepared statements, it's very much the same as we did previously when we wanted to use prepared statements in order to select data from inside the database. So down inside our insert statement, down here inside the SQL variable, I'm going to go ahead and go inside my values and replace the first, last, email, UID, and password. And I'm going to replace these with a question mark, which means that right now we actually created placeholders, which we're then going to give the SQL statement later on when we do actually create a prepared statement. So I'm going to go ahead and delete my MySQLi query down here because we don't actually need it. And then instead, I'm going to go ahead and create a prepared statement just like we did previously. So I'm going to say we have a variable stmt, which is equal to MySQLi underscore stmt underscore init parentheses. And I'm going to do this using the connection to the database, which again is variable con, which I created inside a separate document. I'm going to insert it inside my parameter. And then underneath here, I'm going to go ahead and prepare this prepared statement using this SQL code up here. So we're going to go ahead and do a check, just like we did previously, where we check for failure first. So we're going to say exclamation mark, and then we're going to use a function called MySQLi underscore stmt underscore prepare parentheses, and inside the parentheses, we need to actually write that correctly, like so. Then inside the parentheses, we need to include first of all the statement up here, and then the second parameter is going to be the SQL statement. Now, if we do actually get an error message because it can't actually run this SQL statement inside the database, then it's going to go and run a piece of code that says echo a string called SQL error or something. You can just go ahead and write whatever you want in here. It's just for us to know if there was some kind of error. So after the if statement, I'm going to say we have an else statement. And inside the else statement, we want to actually bind the parameters to the placeholders inside the insert statement, just like we did in the previous part. So what we need to do here is we need to create the function called MySQLi underscore stmt underscore bind underscore param, because we need to bind the parameters to the actual statements. So inside the function parameters, we're going to say we want to use the statement that we created up here. And then the second parameter is going to be the indicator of how many parameters we want to bind to the template we created up here, which in this case is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because we have 5 different placeholders inside the SQL statement. So I'm going to say SSSSS, which is 5 S's. Then afterwards, we're going to say comma, space. And then we need to insert the actual variables that we want to replace with the placeholders inside the SQL statement. So the first one is going to be variable first. So I'm going to say variable first, comma, then variable last, comma, and then we just paste in the rest of them, which is email, comma, UID, comma, and a password, like so. So now that we told the statement what the parameters should be inside the placeholders, let's actually go ahead and run the code inside the database. So we can actually use the function called MySQL underscore stmt underscore execute, parentheses, colon, and then inside the parentheses, we're going to say we have variable statements. We're going to save it and then try to run it inside our browser. So I'm going to go and refresh and type in something inside the inputs. I'm going to say John Doe. Email is going to be john@gmail.com. Then I'm going to go and give him a username called John23. And his password is going to be test123. I'm going to say sign up. And then I'm going to go inside my database, refresh it. And now you guys can see we get John Doe inside the database. So this is how we can actually use prepared statements inside our website when we want to either select or insert data inside a database. And it's the exact same method if you were to, instead of inserting data, if you want to change data or use any of the other SQL statements we have inside SQL, to actually interact with the database. Now, one thing I want to mention before we end off this episode is that it's very important that you guys understand that we used functions in PHP meant for procedural programming inside PHP. So if you were to use object-oriented programming,
Okay, so that's it for today. And what you're going to do, of course, is to create a web, wherein you could able to apply PHP and MySQL at the same time. So you need to have at least 5 in a groups, and assign yourself, or I'll just simply post later the groupings, or the topics, so like let's say for example you are required to create a website, for registration or payroll, enrollment, payroll, library systems, and almost same type of systems that you could able to apply your understanding on PHP and MySQL. So good luck, everyone.